So our Torah portion is Noach. And this is the second Torah portion for the year. We didn't do the first one together because we were traveling. So hopefully you all got to read through that.
And that was creation.
Yep, that was creation. So because we want to do some discussion, I'm intentionally trying to shorten this up. So I'm going to probably leave a whole bunch out because Noah is jam-packed.
So it's chapter what?
We're going to start in chapter 5 to 6. Yeah, it's actually chapter 6, but we're going to pick up the tail end of 5 here.
In Genesis.
In Genesis, yeah. So right at the very beginning again. But yeah, Noah is a jam-packed Torah portion, and gosh, there's just a ton in there. So anyway, but the main theme that I picked up on in studying this is grace, the issue of grace, right? A lot of times coming from the more Western mindset, we hear, well, grace is a New Testament concept, right? We don't hear about grace till Yeshua comes and the apostles and the writings and all this stuff. We don't really see grace on the surface in the Old Testament, but yet it's here. And this is very interesting, especially in this Torah portion, because what do we know about Noah, right? We know that he was a faithful man. We know that he listened to God's voice, and God saved his family, but destroyed the entirety of creation at that point. So it's this very interesting story. How do we get grace out of all this destruction, right? So first we have to start with Noah's name. And this is where we're going to go back into the previous Torah portion in chapter 5, verse 28. And this is Noah's father, Lamech. He lived 182 years and fathered a son, whom he called Noach, or Noah. And I'll just keep going. He says, for he said, this one will comfort us in our labor, in the hard work we do with our hands, to get what comes from the ground that Adonai cursed. Because remember, after the fall, God cursed the ground, right? He says, you'll eat of the fruit of the ground in toil, right? You're going to have to work for this. And so his dad makes this pronouncement over him. He's going to comfort us. Now, this is interesting because some of the sages, particularly Rashi, he says that Noah was the inventor of the plow. And so that's why he was bringing comfort, because he brought this new system to do agriculture and grow. So that was kind of an aside. But anyway, we have Lamech's pronouncement over Noah, over his name. And then right in the next chapter, then we see God declares he's going to destroy the world. But what's interesting is that declaration, we have Lamech's declaration over Noah, and we have God's declaration or pronouncement of judgment. They use similar verbiage, which is really interesting. Now, you'll have to bear with me, but if we go back to chapter 5, verse 28, there are 4 key words that we're looking for. Comfort and regret, or regret. It's a dual word. It means the same thing. It means either comfort or regret. We have deeds or works. We have sadness or toil. And then we have the earth. Okay? These are 4 words. We're going to find these 4 words in Lamech's passage. So starting with 28, and depending what version you have, it's going to read a little different. So it'll be a little tricky. But so Lamech lived 182 years and fathered a son. Verse 29, whom he called Noah. For he said, this one will comfort us. That's Yanaka, and it means comfort or regret, depending how it's used, right? So in this case, it's comfort. That's the first word, comfort, okay? And he says, this one will comfort us in our labor, which that's the second word. That's mima ashenu, which means labor or work, toil, okay? That's the second word. And then So this one will comfort us in our labor in the hard work, and depending what version you have, we'll read toil or burden or something of that nature. That's sadness, right? That's not the Hebrew word. Anyway, I didn't write that down. But that's our third word. And then he will comfort us in our labor in the hard work we do with our hands to get what comes from the ground that Adonai cursed. That is earth. Okay, so these are our four key words that we're looking for. This is all what Lamech said about Noah. Now, we go to chapter 6. And starting with verse 6, we're going to find these same words. So God is making this pronouncement of judgment on the earth, right? It says, Adonai regretted, that's Yanachim, comfort or regret, right? That's our first word. So Adonai regretted that he had made, Mima Ashenu, labor or work, that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved, that's our third word, sadness or toil, grieved his heart. Verse 7, Adonai said, I will wipe out humankind who I have created from the whole earth. Min ha'adamah, earth, right? So we have comfort, deeds, toil, and earth. The same four words that Lamech used to bless his son with, God used to curse the earth with. So there's this tie-in. This is very interesting because here we already get the picture that God is up to something, right? And so it's like, well, how does Noah play into all this? And again, we're talking about the theme of grace. Well, this is where his name gets even more interesting. So Noah and Grace, I'm sorry, you probably guys
No,
can't see.
that's okay, I'm just blocking her. Sorry.
So we have Noach and Grace are made up of two Hebrew letters, Nun and Het. Okay? So depending on the order determines what word we're talking about. So for Noach, it's Nun and Het. Okay? If you take these letters and flip them around, it's the exact same word for grace, which is Het Nun. So his name literally means grace or comfort, right? So we have these curious tie-ins that God is using Noah for something. Something stirring here. But this is the first occurrence of grace revealed in the Torah is Noah's name. So and this is where we're going. It was God's grace to preserve the human race, even though God was justified in the destruction of the human race. Right? You know, it said he regretted that he made mankind. It grieved him in his heart. He was totally justified in wiping everything out and starting over. But yet, he picked Noah to say, I'm going to pull you out and set you aside, preserve you, because you have a destiny and a goal. Right? To bring comfort. So that's the first picture of grace that we see. Now, as we're talking about grace and redemption and things of this nature, we're starting to see a pattern here. And we're only in the second Torah portion, right? We're only in Genesis 6, and we're already picking up on this pattern. Us knowing the rest of Scripture, we can see this. So parallels of redemption. So we have creation, then we have Adam, right? He was the first man. Adam and Eve, they fell, sin entered the world, and then they were in need of redemption. And through that, creation was corrupted. And then we get a few more generations, and then God's like, man, I can't believe I even made you guys. This is terrible. Right? So that leads us to a broken and fallen world, right? Creation is corrupted, mankind's gone astray, sin has entered the world, it's terrible. And we even had, talks about how the Nephilim came down and, corrupted even more, all these kinds of things. Well, then we have Noah, right? Noah is a type of Messiah. He's not the Messiah, but he's a type of Messiah, okay? He's a comforter, one who brings comfort or redemption. So through Noah, and then through the flood, and we'll talk about this in a minute, creation was effectively remade or reset, right? It's like something goes wrong on your computer, you hit Control-Alt-Delete, let's start it over, right? You haven't erased everything, but you're refreshing everything, you're redoing everything, okay? Well, as we read after Noah's story, we read that there was more, even though Noah was called righteous, right? He was still part of that fallen order, right? He was still after the pattern of Adam, right? So he's still born in sin, these kinds of things. And so we see that through his family, through his lineage, more broken family.
There is a fly swatter like by that plant by you guys if you wanted.
Yeah, we
I
get
think I said on the counter.
more broken family, more dysfunction. And all of a sudden we come to Joseph, right? So we have the Tower of Babel, and then we have more generations after that. We come all the way to Joseph. Joseph was a type of Messiah, right? He was one that was set aside to redeem people,
Right.
to save and preserve people, right? So what happened after Joseph? His brothers sell him out. He goes all this stuff, Potiphar's house, ends up in Pharaoh's court, and he ends up being the #2 guy in all of Egypt, with the exception of Pharaoh. With the exception of Pharaoh, he was the #1 guy. He was the man. Well, he ushered in an era of prosperity and blessing for God's people. He effectively said, hey, come to Egypt and live in Goshen, because that was a prosperous place to be. That was the promised land at that point, if you will. Well, that was great for a while. And then what happened? They forgot about Joseph, right? And then now we go back to a broken society, and then the people are enslaved and oppressed, okay? Now we have Moses. Moses, he's a type of redeemer, okay? He takes the people out and redeems them. He takes them out of bondage, out of a broken and pagan culture, institutes a new culture in a new land. Now, he doesn't go into the promised land, Joshua does, but the whole time they're in the wilderness, what is he doing? He's instilling in them this new culture. Let me get you back to that relationship that was way up here with Adam, right? Let's restore that, because we've had a lot of issues between now and then. Well, we know it took a whole generation. The whole generation died off in the wilderness, and it was the new generation that had been inaugurated in that new culture to go into the new land, right? Well, and then all these generations later, what do we have? We're back to a lost and sinful world where we are today, with a people who primarily have forgotten their identity and relationship with the Lord, right? And that's why we study Torah, and that's why we study what God requires of us, so we can get back to the original design and plan, because we've strayed so far. And then we have Yeshua. He is the Messiah, right? And what is his role? To reestablish kingdom rule. And then if we look at all the way to the end of Scripture, Revelation 21, we know he's going to bring a new heaven and a new earth. Much like how Noah was used, right? That's why we say Noah was a type of Messiah, because with him, we have a new creation, in effect, right? We have a new earth, at any rate. Messiah is going to come and bring finality to it. But we have these parallels where when something is broken, God uses someone to bring in something new, right? So this pattern is repeated over and over throughout history.
Your bottom arrow, the first one, you've got a little star by there.
Yep.
What does that say? What
The
one
star
is
right
that? Yeah, well, what does that one say?
So that's the forgotten identity and relationship with God. That's where we are today.
Okay. So I kind of see it, I guess this is how I kind of see it in the flow of things, that last spot, I would see Yeshua as the first one and then us in the middle, because the way I see it in the picture, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Yeshua came to bring us to the place where now the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, now flows through us, almost like he did with Noah and Moses. We are the walking image, if so to speak, of Yeshua, of the kingdom. And so by us, like observing the feast, keeping Shabbat, you're representing to people around you the kingdom. And that is like, what is that? You know, it's new, it's different. And so I kind of see it as Yeshua, then us, and then the reestablishment of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be through us that God desires to use each one of us in our sphere of influence. He's desiring to use us, but that means we have to be set apart for His purpose. That means we are different. I mean, even our neighbor came over, he's like, are you guys Jewish? Is this a Jewish thing? Already asked some questions. He has no idea. I don't know if it was wearing my tassels or if it was our flag. I don't know what. But, and then we get it, you know, going to tabernacles. Our family knows, especially our family that even goes to church, this is who we are. It's our identity. And it's beginning, we're seeing change now even in our family. It's really cool to watch the changes happening in them as they're beginning to make these shifts. So I kind of see it a little bit of a different order where we're really the key. We are truly the key.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. The only thing I'm trying to portray here is just that that's what we do as we await the return of the Messiah. Right? Because we know when Yeshua comes, when He returns, He's going to bring finality to all these things, right? He's going to bring permanence to all these things.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. So, parallels of redemption. And again, we see grace in all this, right? You know, Joseph received grace, and he gave grace. I keep going back to Joseph because that was the topic of what I ministered to these Indian pastors on. And just talking about, you know, his brother sold him out.
Right.
And when he was in authority, he actually jailed them for a short time. He could have left them there. He didn't have to leave them out. He didn't have to reconcile.
Right.
But he said, you know, I'm not about that. I'm about forgiveness. I'm about reconciliation. You know, you guys did what you did, but God had a higher design, a higher plan, right? So things like that, you know, Moses and then Yeshua, you know, all these, you know, God used people and then God Himself, Yeshua, to reestablish all these things, to reset, to, you know, correct the failures of man. So another parallel, while we're talking about parallels. So this is where we get to kind of the meat of Noah's story. And I call this creation 2.0, right? Because we know the earth was created. We just read that in Genesis, you know, in the Torah portion. How God made everything, then He made man and all these things. And then things went sideways, right? And so He comes to Noah and He says, hey, through you, or maybe not through you, but with you, I'm going to remake the world, and then you're going to be my person to reestablish everything, right? So what's interesting, let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to hop back and forth here. So.
For those of you that did not get a tour or do not know, the restroom is right here around the corner, just so you know. If you have not got the official tour yet.
All right. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Well, actually, we'll start with verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2. The earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water. Now, what do we know about the Spirit of God? We know that it's often described as wind, right? The breath of God, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of God, right? It's equated to wind. Now, let's go all the way to Genesis 8, verse 1. It says, God remembered Noah, every living thing and all the livestock with him in the ark. So God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to go down. Now this is interesting because we have, just like in creation, right? God's spirit or wind rested over the waters, presided over creation. And then God causes a wind, again, to preside over the waters, right? He said He remembered Noah, so He caused a wind to come. That was creation day 1, is reiterated in Noah's story. Creation day 2. Go back to chapter 1. We're going to go just back and forth here a little bit. Verses 6 and 8. Creation day 2.
Genesis 1, you said?
Genesis 1. Yep, Genesis 1:6. God said, let there be a dome in the middle of the water. Let it divide the water from the water. Okay? So, what do we have? We have a separation. We have the waters of the sky and the waters below. Right? Sky and sea, or rain and ocean, however you want to describe that. God makes a separation. So we kind of get this idea that it's all just intermingled, that it's all one, that there's just this chaos and things. But then we see another separation in Genesis verse 8. All right, Genesis verse 8, 2 and 3.
Genesis
chapter 8, verse 2 and 3. Excuse me. It says, also the fountains of the deep, the waters below, and the windows of the sky, the waters above, were stopped. The rain from the sky was restrained, and the water came back from completely covering the earth. So again, we have the fountains of the deep and the windows of the sky were stopped, and there was another separation. So again, we have this parallel from creation day 2, where God separated the waters.
Do you want me to shut it in? I can do it.
It's a little loud.
I can do it.
Okay, so day 3. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 9. Get into the third day of creation. So God said, let the water under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. Okay, so land appeared. Genesis 8, verses 5. The water kept going down until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So again, a parallel, right? God said, let land appear in the third day. And with Noah, we have a parallel to that third day of creation where land appears. Now,
How long did it rain?
40 days and 40 nights. Yeah. Now, this is an interesting little side bit. Now, unless you have some of the apocryphal books, you're not going to pick up on this. But verse 4. So let me go back up to verse 4. It says, and the water came back from completely covering the earth. It was after 150 days that the water went down. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Why is that important? Scripture gives us this date. Okay? Well, the book of Jubilees speaks to this. And actually, I'll read that to you. So Jubilees chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. Okay. So book of Jubilees. Now this is talking about Adam and Eve. And he tilled the garden and was naked and knew it not, and was not ashamed. And he protected the garden from the birds and beasts and cattle, and gathered its fruit and ate, and put aside the remnant for himself and for his woman, and put aside that which was being kept. Verse 18. After the completion of the 7 years, which he had completed there, 7 years exactly, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, the serpent came and approached the woman, and the serpent said to the woman, has God commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? This was the exact same date. God caused the rain to stop, or Moses, changed the rain. Let me go back to verse 7:11 here. So Genesis 7:11. On the 17th day of the 2nd month of the 600th year of Noah's life, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the sky were opened. So God caused that rain to stop the exact same anniversary date of when the serpent deceived Eve. All right? Well, what does that mean? This is, if you look at the rain, it's almost a cleansing.
It's almost like the
Right.
mikvah kind of.
It's exactly, it's like a mikvah where I'm going to cleanse what happened with Adam and Eve. I'm going to cleanse that iniquity because I'm remaking everything, right?
Purification of the land.
So yeah, it's a purification. So that was very interesting that those two events tied directly together at the
Did you
exact
guys
same
happen to
age.
notice this? If you read the Torah portion, you may or may not have caught this. And you might have already known this, but it's in chapter 7, it's verse 2. It says, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. So in Sunday school, we're taught 2 of every animal went on the boat.
Right.
No, it's 7 of the clean and then a pair of the unclean. It's
Yeah.
not 7 clean, it's 7, so it'd be 14. So 7 pairs of clean animals and
Okay.
just 1 pair of unclean. So
Oh.
when people want to debate that kosher and clean and versus unclean is not
Like
for today, why did
Right.
God have Noah take on the boat so many clean animals? Because he knew they needed to eat.
Wow.
He knew that.
Do,
So it is kind of funny because they don't teach you that in Sunday school.
do you know
So-
do you know the month? I know it's kind
The
of,
month of,
it's, some people get, like, you're getting too technical, but to me, I like to try and figure out, I'm a numbers type person. I like to, when they get into the genealogies and stuff, I always have a hard time between the Hebrew calendar and our Gregorian American calendars to try and figure out, okay, what month are they actually talking about? And when I try to compare, I don't know if I'm actually getting it right or not. Was that October? Our October?
I don't think so, but I'm not entirely positive,
what-
so
what
I'm a
month-
little
Well, did
fuzzy
wasn't the
myself.
Say.
7th month of below? And we
Right.
celebrated that in
But I don't think it's,
July?
I don't think it's the 7th month, it's the 7th,
Of the Jewish.
yeah,
That's-
I don't think it's related to the calendar. Let me find this because this was brought up, on a teaching.
Oh.
Because every time it goes through, I start putting the month down
Yeah.
with
We
a
don't.
question mark, September,
We don't.
May, August, you know, I don't know. What month of the year did this actually?
Yeah, I looked at this and I lost it.
They're not gonna be referring to a Gregorian calendar, it's gonna be more,
Right, I
Yeah.
know, but to be able to compare.
right.
But I think it was
Would it be
related
our
to,
September, our.
It was
It's a Hebrew calendar.
no, I think it was related to to that particular year. They're referencing
Oh.
the year of his life.
Oh.
So they don't, it's really like, in this year, the 7th month of this year, but we don't know where, where that,
Oh.
You know what I mean?
Oh,
Babe,
okay.
in verse 7, verse 11, it says in the 600th year of Noah's life, and then it goes in the 2nd month.
yeah.
The 17th.
So we know it's the 600th year, we don't know
What is it?
where in the year, is what I'm saying. Was it December, was it,
Well, it's not saying
July,
the
I
Tell
second
you
month
what,
after
you
the
can-
year
you can Google
started.
that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
maybe, I
Because I
don't
don't
know.
think scripture goes by their birthdays.
Simple as that. You
It
can
says
Google
the
a
7th
lot.
month.
Yeah,
Oh,
well, and that's the
fair.
thing, we have to find out, okay, what year was he, what month was he
See, I'm
born?
like, you know,
And then track the 600 years, you know what I mean, because you got that
It
shift.
could go either way.
We can't assume that it's, speaking of the Gregorian, that it's January 1st and it's 7 months, you know what I mean?
Right.
We don't know where that's at.
If it was the second month, then it would be about this time though.
So,
If it was
And that's
after
why, and that's why
Hebrew
I don't think it's related to the Hebrew calendar.
and
I could be wrong about that, but I don't believe
is-
that's,
is-
Because
And then there's so many different calendars
So-
that then it just gets even
Yeah.
more confusing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
a lot gave some.
you had a question, Ron?
I answered it myself. You were saying the 17th day on the second
I'm
month,
trying to figure it out.
but I was on Genesis 7 verse, I don't know where I was, but it was the 17th day of the 7th month.
Yeah.
And you kept saying the 17th day of the second month, and I thought, wait a minute, am I supposed to?
Oh, did I say that wrong?
No, you didn't. I found
Oh,
back in Genesis 7 verse 11.
Verse 11
On
is
the
where that says that.
17th day of the second month,
yep.
but then I can't find the 17th day of the 7th. Oh, Genesis 8 verse 4. That's
Yeah,
when the ark came to
8-4,
rest.
yeah.
Yeah.
So and that's where I was when you were saying 17th on the second month.
Oh, okay.
And I thought, well, wait a minute, something's not adding up. So, but answer that question.
Yeah, it's in there a couple different times.
Yeah. So, interesting things. So, jumping back in, day 4, right? So, what's the parallel to day 4 of creation? Let's go back to Genesis 1, verses 14 through 19. So God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, seasons, days, and years. All right? So we have seasons, right? We have night and day. We have the solar, all this kind of stuff. And then going to verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 22, it says, Yet Adonai smelled the sweet aroma, and Adonai said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, since the imaginings of a person's heart are evil from his youth, nor will I ever again destroy all living things as I have done. Verse 22, so as long as the earth exists, sowing time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. So again, we have this reference to the seasons, which ties us right back to day 4 of creation. Now that's a little out of order, but again, we have this parallel.
Did you get them?
So day 5, the parallel there, and this is kind of neat for me. So chapter 1, verse 20, and God said, let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open dome of the sky. And then going back to chapter 8, this is where we get the name for our ministry, is verse 7, chapter 8, verse 7. And he sent out a raven, which flew back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had gone from the surface of the ground. So it's interesting, we have a reference to birds, just like in day 5 of creation. Again, we get this pattern that God is remaking everything. So that's why we have these parallels.
That's cool.
Day 6. Go back to chapter 1, verses 24 through 27. God said, let the earth bring forth each kind of living creature, each kind of livestock, crawling animal, and wild beast. And that is how it was. God made each kind of wild beast, each kind of livestock, and every kind of animal that crawls along the ground, and God saw that it was good. Verse 26, and God said, let us make humankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the animals, and over all the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls in the earth. So again, we have man and animals are made, right? Day 6. Well, chapter 8, verse 16, and we'll start with verse 15. God said to Noah, go out from the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing you have with you, birds, livestock, and every animal that creeps on the earth, so that they can swarm on the earth, be fruitful, and multiply on the earth. So again, we have man and animals were made on day 6, and in Noah's story, we have Noah, his family, and his sons and their families. We have man and then animals, right? And so with Noah, man and animals, that portion of creation was preserved. That was the grace, right? I'm justified in destroying everything, but because of my grace, I'm going to set aside someone that can start over. Right? I'm not just going to completely wipe everything out. But in this accounting, we actually have where creation was remade. Right? Everything was restored and renewed. So now mankind gets another shot at, approaching God in the way that he would desire, restoring that relationship. Now, Mandy kind of stole part of my sermon.
Sorry, I didn't know who was going to be on there. I saw you cast it in scripture, so I didn't know. I should have known you.
That's okay. That's all right.
She's a good helpmate.
She is.
Yeah.
So, chapter 9, we have the Noahide laws. So what are these laws? Be fruitful and multiply, right? Where have we heard that before? That was the same one given to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply, have dominion, okay? So that was a first law, if you will. And what I'm getting with that is that we see where we have the law given to Adam and Eve, it's repeated with Noah and built upon, and then with Moses, it's repeated and built upon, right? So we have this continual covenant relationship that keeps getting built upon, built upon, built upon. Now, in the Western mindset, we're taught that, okay, Yeshua comes, and so we take all those and all that stuff and just get rid of it. But yet, what does Yeshua do? He builds upon. If you really look at it, he builds upon all these things. He doesn't do away with them, right? I came to fulfill the law.
Right.
Not as in fulfill as in I'm going to do away with the old. I'm fulfilling as in filling up with meaning. Take this foundation you've been given, and I'm going to instruct you and reveal things to you so you can fully understand. Right?
Wasn't it just that he, as far as the old part of the law, that a lot of people think it's everything, like what you're saying, but really, all that he really got rid of was when he died on the cross and shed his blood. That was the one sacrifice that got rid of all the other sacrifices. That's why we don't have to sacrifice animals this day.
He was the ultimate
That's
sacrifice.
basically the law that he did away with. But all the rest he didn't really.
Yeah, you look at it, he celebrated all the feasts. You know, we talk about tassels, he wore tassels, and we have the woman with the issue of blood, all these kinds of things. And yet, so yes, we don't need to sacrifice animals anymore because he was the perfect sacrifice, right? Whereas before, shed blood would merely, it was a covering, right?
Also, keep in mind, some of the animal sacrifices they did were also offerings too. It wasn't it wasn't for sin.
It wasn't specifically for
but
sin.
it was an offering to the Lord. It was a form of worship.
Mm-hmm.
So if we had the temple, there could be what we would think is sacrifices, but it's not necessarily sacrifice for sin, but an offering to the Lord. So just kind of keep that in mind too. A lot of people, it does get very confusing. And it's kind of like, well, what do we do? What don't we do? And I think that's why a lot of the Christians tend to get confused by it. Because the Jews have all these laws, well, you have to do all of this, and like for Sabbath, you can't even turn off the light. And they put too much on the law, where the Christian is like, I'm not doing all of that, and they're overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
So
it's just there's extremes in both sides where you know, we even do this in Western Christianity where we have our traditions we put over scripture. And it's just the other side of the ditch. It really is.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Abel, when he sacrificed whatever he had, a lamb or whatever it was, the Lord, it was Abel, right? And Cain and Abel?
Yep.
Okay, did God tell him that was the way?
Well, and this is where we get, because we don't have the laws recorded, we know that there was an oral tradition, or it was passed down orally.
So he was the first one, then it went down to...
Because it was well before Moses established it.
And so, and that creates a problem for a lot of folks that when we say, well, all the stuff Moses did, that's no longer relevant. Well, what about before Moses?
Moses wasn't the first one.
We already have a reference with Noah. This is way before Moses. That God told him clean and unclean. How do you know what's clean and unclean unless you've heard it? There had to be a record somewhere.
So Moses wasn't the first one that said to eat only clean animals.
With Cain and Abel, how did Abel know to sacrifice an animal? And yet, how did, when God talked to Cain and Abel, how did he say, your sacrifice is accepted and yours isn't?
And was that sacrifice he did even for sin? It wasn't, the scripture doesn't say that was for sin. That could have been an offering, the first fruits, like what we would give as our tithe. That could have been their first fruits offering. They burnt it up as a fragrance, a beautiful incense, and a form of worship. So culture was different.
What was the difference between Cain and Abel's offering? Sacrifice?
Not,
This,
Some people say it was the attitude of his mind or.
Yeah.
yes, that's what I was just gonna say.
yeah.
It
Well,
was
Cain's wasn't
A
right.
heart.
Yeah, the heart
a
issue.
heart, it was a heart thing.
Yeah, because, you know, we know that Abel raised animals, Cain was a farmer, right? So he was bringing the produce of his labor, right? The fruits of his labor, which is entirely warranted, but yet it was rejected. So it had to be something
It
with
was,
how he presented it.
it was an
Which
issue.
again-
What he presented, maybe it was the last of the harvest instead of the first of the
Yeah,
harvest, or
but-
whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
Again,
Or
it's
maybe
like-
he kept some of the best for him, because you're supposed to bring the best to God and give the best of your produce or whatever.
But it still
It
underlies,
wasn't
it underscores the
necessary.
fact that if I don't know what to bring or how to do things, then anything I bring should be acceptable, right? But if I know, if there's a standard established and I deviate from that standard, then I get corrected. Otherwise, it seems very, very cruel and unjust on God's behalf to say, no, I'm not accepting that, and what Cain's just like, I don't. you didn't-
I did what I thought.
Yeah, you didn't tell me nothing, but wait a minute, maybe somebody did tell him something.
Right.
Maybe there was a standard.
There's, if anybody listens to Pastor Rydelnik on Return to the Bible, or Through the Bible, and those kinds of things on radio, he has a very, very good definitive understanding. It takes all speculation out of it. The reason for the human sacrifice was a type of Christ. Now here again, who knew that I was doing this wrong? Who knew that the first of my harvest would not be accepted? So there was a right and a wrong, a good and a better way to do this. And there's a beautiful breakdown of this whole thing that just takes all speculation out of it. And it shows the ritual, where it went into the Hebrew ritual going forward.
Yeah, so we know a lot of these things get passed down. So back to the Noahide laws, we have be fruitful and multiply, which we see that in Genesis 1:28, way before Noah's time. And then eating of blood. Now, if you really unpack a lot of what was going on in Noah's time, we know the Nephilim came down, they had children, that's where the giant, children with men, and that's where we get the giants from and all these things. Well, these giants were so large that they resorted to cannibalism to feed themselves. They ultimately died out because a lot of them, they couldn't feed themselves, right? And so that's where we get this, according to the sages, that's why there was a prohibition of eating blood, because of the cannibalistic things that were going on during Noah's time, preceding Noah's time. And then we have murder and capital punishment. He says you shouldn't murder, and then you should institute like a jurisprudence system. Okay, Scripture talked about that. So these were what we call the Noahide laws. Now, we know a lot of this gets repeated with what we would call the Mosaic law, the law that God gave to Moses and Moses gave to the people. So these form the foundation that God, through Moses, built upon. Now, it's interesting, and Mandy talked about this in Genesis 7:2. God describes clean and unclean animals. Okay? So somewhere, it was not recorded in the sense that we would, pick up a book and read it, but it was communicated that these animals are clean, these are unclean. You take so many of these animals and not so many of these, right?
We don't have a clear what animals were what.
Well, we
There in
don't
Genesis.
get that till
We
the
get that
Mosaic.
later,
Yeah.
yes, with Moses. We see more of a clear, what does it look like to be clean versus unclean?
Yeah. So, but this is the oral tradition, right? Things that are passed on orally. This is where we get the kashrut laws or the kosher laws. Now, it's interesting that some in the, whether you want to call it Hebraic roots or Messianic or whatever label you want to put on it, some argue that only the Noahide law applies to the Gentiles, right? So if you're a natural born Israelite or a Jew, then you would follow the Mosaic laws, but if you're not, you only have to observe these. Okay? And because they skip over Genesis 7:2, they say, well, you don't have to eat kosher, you just have to obey these. Right? But again, Genesis 7:2 throws a monkey wrench in that. Because if that was the case, that we had to fulfill this, we have to take into account Genesis 7:2, clean and unclean.
Right.
So what that would mean is that all Gentiles would be required to eat kosher, way before the Mosaic law was given. Okay? Now, this is interesting. If you look, there's only 10 generations from Adam to Noah. So now, if we're talking about oral traditions, right? God's going to communicate with Adam, right? He walked with him, talked with him, communed with him in the garden. Adam ultimately talks to Enosh. Enosh was a grandson of Adam, right? Enosh knew Methuselah, and Methuselah was the father of Lamech, right? So we have grandson to father, father, and then son. We're only a few generations. Lamech very well may have known Adam. Could be entirely possible. He knew Adam, or you know what I mean?
So that could be
We're not
how
talking like
clean and unclean was passed down.
exactly.
There's a lot of traditions, or not traditions, but a way of living that's passed down to our children.
Yep.
The way we live.
Yeah, and then before they lived long.
Yeah, they lived like 500, 800
Yeah.
years. Which is a very interesting study, because it's after Noah, you'll see the days of man significantly
Significantly 200 and 100.
Well, it worked its ways down up to 120 years. The scripture says the full days of man will be 120 years. Mm-hmm.
Let's go to.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that, the law continues to build upon itself. And then Yeshua comes and he really unpacks it for us. I like to think of it as, when we're in preschool, right? We learn our ABCs, kindergarten, we learn how to count. What do? We don't disregard that. Oh, I'm in high school now. I have built upon that,
build
right?
that foundation.
Through all these, through all my elementary years, I have built upon my ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. Now I'm doing multiplication. Now I'm in high school. Now I'm doing algebra. But I still need to know that 1 + 1 is 2. I can't say, oh, I'm doing algebra now. I don't need to know how to count to 10 anymore, right? We continue to build on these things. They serve as the foundation. And that's much like the Torah. We're given these laws, these ordinances to serve as a foundation, so that way when Yeshua comes, we can understand, what the heck is this guy talking about, right? He breaks it down. 2 overarching commands: love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that sounds easy. How do I do that? Well, let's dig a little deeper. Now go to your foundation and you can see, this is how I can carry those 2 things out, right? So, pretty interesting. To wrap up, the Brit Hadashah in Matthew 24, verses 36. It says, "But when that day and hour will come, no one knows, not the angels in heaven, not the Son, only the Father. For the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. Back then, before the flood, people went on eating and drinking, taking wives and becoming wives, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. And they didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. It will be just like that when the Son of Man comes." So this is interesting, because we have this picture of our generation, right? People just living their lives, doing whatever they want to do, right? And not worrying about anything. Well, we know we live in an idolatrous culture, right? If we're not worshiping something external to us, we're worshiping ourselves.
Amen.
And Why do we do that? We have forgotten our identity. Just like with these cycles of redemption, right? We've gotten all the way back here. We've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten our relationship to our Creator. And we know Yeshua's coming back to reestablish kingdom rule and to create a new heaven and a new earth, right? So we're in this final cycle of redemption. And just like Mandy was talking about, this is where we become an example to the culture around us. We're living for the Lord the best we can, trying to follow His precepts and mandates the best we can, right? Relying on grace and be an example to the world while we await the return of the Messiah. And yet, again, we know we have grace in this. You know, we see this through all the patriarchs of the faith. That, okay, things get off track, God sends someone to correct, to course correct. And what has been the message with all these men? Live righteously in a fallen world, right? Remain righteous in the midst of oppression, okay? Come out of paganism, come out of the broken world systems. And then Yeshua, making all things new again. So these cycles and patterns of redemption, and we have a new creation. So the story is really interesting, and for me it just underscores that in an age and dispensation of grace, if you will, that God has not abandoned His people, and He's still here, He's still for us, He's still with us, if we are endeavoring to be obedient and faithful. So that is Noach, and there's probably a whole ton more in there, but
You know what was
we're keeping it
interesting
short.
too? Yesterday, did you guys see the rainbow? I saw some of you saw the rainbow.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool because it lined right up with our Torah portion.
Yeah.
So it's like God is, at the same time we are reading Noah and studying his word, he reminds us of that promise that he made